Hello developers, I hope you are all doing well. Today we'll be diving into the fascinating world of CSS Grid Layout. It is an exciting journey that will empower you to create beautiful and responsive layouts for your web projects. So let's embark on this learning adventure together. If you have been following the course, you are aware before any class, you can get the resources that we'll use for that class in our GitHub repository that you forked and cloned. If you are new, I'll provide the link to that repo in the video description for you to clone it and access today's notes. And if you have cloned that, you can go to your Visual Studio Code, open the terminal and use the git pull command to fetch today's resources. So without much ado, let's dive in and start learning about CSS Grid Layout. If you pull the notes, you'll see this folder written 12 CSS Grid Layout. It is inside the CSS folder. And inside that folder, there's this readme file which contains the notes that we'll use in today's class. So let me create a new file. I'll call it index.html. Here I'll write my boilerplate. Then I'll change the title to CSS Grid Layout. Then I'll provide the link to my style sheet, which I've not yet created, but I'll do so in a few minutes. Then I think that is done for the HTML. Then I'll create my style sheet also. I'll call it style.css, like that. So you can see I have my readme. I open my readme using the Markdown previewer here. So I'll be having my HTML file here. I think I've linked it, okay. Then I have my CSS file and I have my notes here. So I think I'm now ready to start the CSS Grid Layout. And if you're ready with me, let's start learning about CSS Grid Layout. So similar to Flexbox, to create a grid container, you need a div. You need a container div. So I'll create a div of class container here. Container, I think I missed the spelling, container, like that. So I need a div of class container. Then that div will have 3 children of class. I'll give them a class of items, 3 of them, like that. Then each item will have an extra class. We said any element can have more than one class. So these children, I give them 2 classes. One is for items, the other one is for items, then each one has an individual number. Then I'll give this, I'll call this one 1, this one will be 2, this one will be 3. So now I have a container with these 3 items. So similar to Flexbox, for me to make this container to be, in fact I'll just copy the code that you wrote yesterday. Where is it? Just copy these 2 codes for the container and for the item. I want to style today's entity to style like yesterday, but I'll remove these ones. These ones are for the Flexbox. I'll just remove them, and also I'll remove, I think, the height and the width. That is okay. I think my prettier is off. Let me first turn on my prettier. I think I turned it off. Not sure when. Formatting. Yeah, I think my prettier on save is not working, so I'll turn it on here. Yeah, that was the thing that was missing. So like we said, prettier helps me. You can see it when I save my code, it just arranges it automatically. So here you have seen I have a container. I've set the height and the width. Then I put this margin 0 out. I'll remove this display flex because we're not learning about flex today. So it has a height, width, margin, and it has a border. And the item that I put them, I call them items. So let me just remove the S so that it can be similar to yesterday's. I'll just call it item. So each item will have a background color of that. It's purplish. It's almost purple, yeah. Then we'll have a border of blue. and a padding of 20 pixels. Let me remove this padding, we don't need it today. Text align center bold there. That is how we want this container to be. And we saw how that was in the previous class. So if you want to make a grid container, you have to make the container to have a display of grid or grid inline. But if you put grid inline, it will act like an inline element. But I don't mind to act like an inline element, so I'll just place display grid. And that way, my container will be a grid container. Let us go to the browser and see how this is before we continue. So if you go to the browser, you can see nothing happened. Let me just inspect to confirm. Yeah, nothing happened because you have to set you have to go and define your, yeah, if I click on this screen, you can see there's these numbers, but they are not well. So I have to go back to my code and define my rows and my columns, how I want my rows and columns to be. So that is our first lesson today, how to define rows and columns inside your container. So you can see now you have a grid container, because if I inspect, I can see this grid here, and if I click on it, I can see some numbers are written. These are tags for the lines. They are written along. They're written at the sides of that container. So let me go to my editor and define the rows and the columns. Then we can come back to the browser and see how the rows and columns are. So to define our rows and columns, we use this grid template rows and grid template columns. So these ones are grid template rows and also grid template columns. So in grid template rows, you define how many rows you want and their size. And also in grid template column, you define how many columns you want and their size. So allow me to create 6 rows and 6 columns, each to have a size of 100 pixels. So I'll write 100 pixels 6 times. This is 3 times. I'll just copy this and paste it there for it to have 6 times. Then I'll also put the same in the rows. So you can see now I have 6 rows and 6 columns, and the size of each cell will be 100 pixel width and height. And I've defined that using this size here set in the rows and in the columns. So now let's go to the browser and see how our grid will be, how our grid container will be now that you have the rows and the columns. So let's go to the browser. So if you go to the browser, you can see our elements are, let me just inspect. Let me see the developer options to show you something. So if you go here inside the body, you can see if I click this grid, you can see this, our container is now visible. So you can see this is our container, not this red one. Our container is up to here. It did not cover the whole of it. So this is now our grid container that we define the rows and the columns. So you can see it has tags this side and this side. All round of it has tags. So these ones are the tags for the rows, and each number represents a line. So this one represents this first line, 2 represents the second line, 3, like that up to 7. And you can see this line is labeled 2 and -6 this side. So to reference this line, I can use either 2 or -6. And also these other lines, these ones are rows. By the rows, we said earlier that rows run from left to right and columns from top to bottom. So rows, these ones are the rows, and rows are labeled. This one is the label for the rows. This for this side are for labels for the rows, and the ones for the top and bottoms are the label for the columns. So I can position my elements anyhow, any place that I want, using this represents that I got. So I think you have seen how you can define your rows and columns inside your container by defining their sizes, and you look at better ways to define our rows and columns in container. But now that is the most basic one, so let us stick with that for now. And now let us look at how we can position elements anywhere inside this container. So let us go back to our Visual Studio Code and see how we can position elements inside the grid container. So if I want to position an element, let's say I want to position the first element, for you to position an element, you have to define where the row starts, where the row ends, where the column starts, and where the column ends. So if I want to position the first element, I'll select it using this. I gave it a class of item -1. So I'll write here item-1 to select the first item. Then I'll use this property called grid row start. I'll say grid row start. Then where do I want? Let's say I want my first element to start at the first line. So I'll keep there 1. and I want it to go up to the third row. So grid row end will be row 3. Grid row end will be 3. Then I want it to start at column 1 and then end at column 5. So grid column start I'll put it 1. Then grid column end, I'll just copy it and write this one to be end. I need to end at 5. So that way, that is how I position my elements in the container. So for me to position, I have to define where the row starts and where the row ends and where the column starts and also where the column ends. And that way, my first item is positioned using these styles that I defined here in the container. So let's go to the browser and see how that element is positioned. So if you go to the browser, you can see that our first element is positioned. Let me first return the developer, the inspect, like that. So you can see that my first element is positioned where I defined it. So I set the row start to be 1. So it has started at this first row. This is the first line of the row. Then it will end at the third row. This is the third line. So it will start from the first line to the third line. I think that is visible. Then the column to start from the first column. This is the first line of the column to go up to the 5th line. This is the 5th line. So my element will be placed here. And that is where I define my element. So the next thing that I want to position this second element to cover this space here, this box here. So I'll set the row start to be, this is the first row, 1. Then I'll set the row end to be here, 3. But then the column start now will start here at 5, then it will end at 7 for it to cover this box. So let us go to our VS Code and write that code. Then I also want to place this my third one to cover this all space here. So I want to style item 2 and item 3. Allow me to copy this code. Then we'll go to edit it in the developer options. So this will be for item 2. This one will be for item 3. Currently they'll overlap because I put the same value for both, but we'll change the values on your developer options. So let us go to the browser and change this for item 2 and item 3 to position them how we want them to behave in the container. So if you go to the browser, you can see all our items are stacked on top of each other. So all of them are here. Item 1, 2, and 3, all of them are here. I want to place my item 2 here. So where is item 2? This is item 2. So I'll just edit item 2 and the row start to be 1. That is okay. The row end to be 3. That is okay. But the column start and the column start to be 5. So I'll write column start 5 like that. Then the column end, I'll write the column end to be 7. So my second element will cover this space here. So if I want this third element to cover all of this space, let me style the third element, this one. The row start, I want it to start here. So that my row start will be 3, not 1. It will now be 3. Then my row end will go up to 7. So my row end will be 7. Then my column start, just want it to be 1. Then my column end will be 7. So I think you have seen how we can position elements inside the container by just defining where the rows start and end, and also where the columns start and ends. And that is how we position elements inside the container. So now let us learn about some more ways of positioning elements that are even simpler. So let's go back to VS Code and learn some more ways. So there's this property called the grid row property. And the grid row property defines on which row to place an item. So in short, the grid row is a shorthand for this row start and row end. So if I, for example, write here grid row like that, this property expects a start value and a end value, where the row should start and where the row should end. So let me just put the same values. So I want the row to start. If you want the row to start at 1, write here 1. You want it to end at 3, write here 3 like that. So this line of code, this one is same as these two lines combined. So if I just comment this one and I just remain in this one, it will just be the same. Also there's another one called grid column property. So just like the grid row, this grid column property is a shorthand. It's a shorthand for grid column start and grid column end. So if I want here, you put the start value, then you put the end value like that. So this one line for grid column is similar to these two lines combined. So if I comment that and I leave it that way, my container will just behave the same, because I use this grid row shorthand property to combine the row start and the row end, all of them at once, separating them with this /. So let's go to the browser and confirm that this works. If you go to the browser, you can see that nothing has changed. Everything is the way that it was. But this item 1, you have now defined it using this grid row and grid column. So this grid row, this 1 is for the grid row start, this 3 is for the grid row end, and this column 1 is for the column start, 5 is for the column end. I think you can see it here in the developer options. That way, we'll have defined both the row start and the row end, and the column start and the column end, all in using two properties. And initially, you can see we were using 4 properties. I'll just confirm with this item 2. You're seeing in item 2, you're using 4 properties, and now the properties are down to 2, and it still achieves the same output. So I think this one is better than the previous one. And there's even a more simpler way. Let us look at it before there's even a more simpler way of defining the row start, row end, column start, and column end. Let's go to the VS Code and see that simpler way. Before you even learn that simpler way, let us first convert these other ones to use this grid row and grid column. So I'll write here grid row, or I'll just give you that as an assignment. Just pause the video for 1 second and try to convert this item 2 and item 3 to use the grid row and grid column properties. So just pause the video for some time and try to do that by yourself before you proceed. Okay, I think you have done it. So I'll just show you the answer. So for me to use the grid row here, I can just say grid row that. Then I provide the start value and the end value. Then I'll just delete this one there. I'll delete them because I've said that this one line of code does all that magic. And here I can use the grid column. Then I put 5 and 7. Then I can delete this one here. The same way I can do here, grid row 3, 7. Then here, grid column. What is it? 1, 7. 1, 7 like that. Then I can just delete these ones and also these ones. I can save my code like that. And I can also delete these comments, or I can just leave them for different. But I think now you know a simpler way, so I'll just delete them. So that is a simpler way to define a row start and column start. And I think you got it right. If you didn't, that is the answer. There's always room for practice and improvement. So let's go to the browser and see that our elements are still the same way. Let's go to the browser and confirm that our elements are still the same way. So if you go to the browser, you can see that our 3 elements are just positioned the way that we positioned them at the beginning. But now we have used a more simpler code, the grid row and the grid column. I also want to show you something. You have seen that element 1 has ended here and element 2 has started immediately where element 1 has ended. So there's this keyword called the span keyword. So here in the grid row, instead of writing 1, 3, you can write span 2 like that. In short, how many rows? To span is just to extend or to cover how many rows. This span 2 for the row. So I've told my element 2 where the element 1 has ended, span 2 rows, and it just remained the same. Also here I can say span 2 columns, and it will take 2 columns. So where element 1 has ended, it will take 2 columns from where element 1 has ended. But you have to be keen in using this span, because this span depends on other placed elements, other positioned elements. We have seen this one worked because our element 1 ended here. But let's say you want to place our element 2 here where it is, but let's say someone placed element, where is element 1, and instead of ending at 4, where does 1, 4, 5, instead of 5 and to put 4 here. If I remove this 5 and put 4, you can see now our element 2 is positioned somewhere where we did not want. We wanted it to be here, but I didn't touch element 2, I touched element 1 and element 2 moved. That is the effect of using the span. But if I did not use the span, if it was the way it was before, it was 5, 7 for the row. Row it was 1, then 1, row 1 to row 3, it was that way. Then the column was 5 to 7, so here was 5 slash 7. You can see if I put it that way, it remains where, although I changed the position of the 1, this 2 does not move. But if I use the span keyword, the 2 is dependent on the 1. If the 1 moves, the 2 will move. That is the effect of the span. And the effect can be seen even further. Let me return the span keyword. Let me return here span 2 and span 2 here. The effect can be even more worse when you, let me extend this, instead of 3, let me put here 7. I want this first row to cover the entire space till the end. I'll put here 7. Not there. The column 4 here, 7. Not the row, the column 4 to 7 for it to cover. So you have seen our second element is moved here. It has been thrown here, and that is the effect of using span. But if you are not to use span, if you are to use the row start and the row end, there it was before. It was row start was we wanted it to start here, so 1, 3. So it was 1 slash 3. Then the column span was 5 slash 7. So even if you have seen, even if you move the 1, the 2 will still be here. It will not move. Although the 1 has covered all the space, the 2 will be here, and it will create layering. You'll learn about layering in a few moments. But I was showing you the effects of using this span keyword. It might work okay, but it is dependent on other elements. So if some elements change, let me return it there it was. I'll just refresh. Just like that. So if this span keyword is okay to use, but that is only if other elements don't change, they stay the same. But if any other elements change, this span keyword might not be effective. So I'll just show you how the span keyword was. It was that I was spanning 2 columns and 2 rows. You can see I'm using span and it is just okay. But you have seen how if you change the position of the first element, it will affect the second. And that is how you use span, and those are the effect of span. So I think you know how to use span. So now let us learn about the shorthand of putting the row start and the row end, all of them at once. So there's this property called the grid area. And the grid area, like we said, it puts the row start, column start, all of them in one line. It's called grid area. So for grid area, it will take here the row start. Here will be the value for the row start. Then the next value will be for the column start, col start. Then it will be row end. And then the last value will be col end. So you can see that the grid area takes all the 4 values at once. So if you want to position an element, you can either use the row start individually, or you can use you have seen how to use the grid row and grid column. And also you can also use the grid area to position both the row column, the row start, the column start, the row end, and the column end, all of them at once. And let us see how this is in effect. So the row start was 1, the column start was 1. So you keep in mind it's row start, then column start. Then after I finish the starts values, start with the end values. Row end is 3, column end is 5. So this one line has combined all these 2 lines. So I think you have seen we started from 4 properties, we came down to 2, and now you're down to 1 property. That position you can now position an element using just one property. And that is the grid area. You can just apply the grid area in the rest. Maybe you can do it as assignment. You can just pause the video and try to write the grid area of this item 2. Try to write that grid area of item 2 and also the grid area of item 3 as your assignment for now. You can just pause the video and try to write that out first before you proceed. So I think you have written. So I'll just show you the answer. So the grid area row start is 1, column start is 5, row end is 3, column end is 7, like that. So I can just remove these ones. For this one, the row start is 3, the column start is 1, the row end is 7, the column end is 7, and I can also remove these ones. So you have seen how we can do all those in just a single line, and this makes our code even more simpler. Our code will be short and easy to read. So let's go to the browser and confirm if this grid area works. So if you go to the browser, you can see that our code is still the same. Then I forgot to, I think I told you this. You can notice that I was using these positive values only. You can also use the negative value to identify either a row or a column. So this one was for the row start. You have seen the row start is this line. It's 1, and it can also use it -7. So instead of 1 here, I can write here -7 for the first value. Instead of writing 1, you can see some people writing something like -7. It's just the same thing. Like I told you earlier, this line is referenced using two different values. The positive value, this one is 1, and the negative value is -7. Also this column, let's say column 5. This is the column end 5. So this column end 5, you can reference it using -3. See here, just follow that line to the end and see the value. So if I put here -3 for the column end, it will work just the same. So just work the same that it was before, and you can see it's just works the same, but I use the negative values. So that is it in how to position elements. So let's look at the next thing. I think now you know how to use the negative numbers and both the positive numbers. So let us look at layering in grid. So let us try to put this element 2 and try to put it here on top of this. You can just do it here in the developer options. Where is that element 2? So element 2, instead of it being here, I want it to be here on top. So the row start will be 2. The row start will be not be 1, it will be 2. The row start will be 2. Then the row end will be 4. First I want to put the column start. Column start will just remain like that, 5. No, not 5. Column start will want it to be here. So column start will be 4. 4 for it to move here. Then the row end should be here till here, 4. The row end will also be 4. Then the column end want it to be here, so 6. You can always use the negative value. It depends on your preference. So you can see our second element is now placed here. Let me use I think it's below, so I'll just use the Z index. We already learned about the Z index and know how to use it. So I'll use the Z index and put the Z index of 1 to make this element 2 come on top. So you can see our element 2 is here on top. It's on top of these two elements. And that is how we can place layering using the grid container. You can place elements on top of other elements using grid. And as you can see, using grid is even simpler, because you just define an element to be on top of other element where you want to be. And it's just simple like that. And you can use the Z index property to make an element. You said Z index is used to make an element. If two elements are on top of each other, the element that you want it to be on top, it should have a higher Z index value than the other element. So by default, all elements have a Z index value of 0. So if I give item 2 as a Z index value of 1, it will be higher than these two, so it will become on top. And we talked about Z index in the previous classes, so I'll not stress on it too much. The thing that I'll stress is this layering. You can just place items on top of other items simply using grid box, and you can see it's just simple. There's no extra thing that you're learning. You just use the same grid area property and you position it on top of other elements. You can just place any element anywhere that you want, and you can achieve any layering that you want. So that is it with layering. So the next thing that we learn is something that happens when, in case you add, you can see, let me just remove this layering. Let me just refresh to remove. I think you have seen the layering. So I just refresh to remove the layering, because you have said that if you write your code in the developer options, it does not save it in the code. So if I refresh, you can see it just returns how it was in the code, how it was before it was that way. So you can see that now our container is full. There's no cell that is not occupied. So my question is, what happens when I add an extra element. You see now we have 3 elements. What if I add element 4? What will happen? So let's go to VS Code and add element 4 because I don't want to add it here. Let me go ahead and add it in the VS Code and you can see what will happen if we add a 4th element. So let us go back to our Visual Studio Code. So I want to add an extra child. Let me add an extra child in HTML. I'll just duplicate this, then I'll rename this to item 4. And this I'll rename it to 4. Then I'll save my code. So I've added an extra child. Let me also increase the height. Let me put something like 800. I've added an extra child. So let us see what will happen if you add an extra child and our grid container is full. What will happen? So let's go to the browser and see what will happen. So you can see that when you added a new element, it came here below. So despite not having any room left, our grid added a new row for item 4. And when items are added outside the explicitly defined grid, this is referred to as an implicit grid. And notice how item 4 is larger than the other one because this implicit grid does not inherit the values that we set in the grid template. So this item 4 is larger than these other ones because this item 4, the values for the rows and columns are not set, the size is not set. If you can remember, these other ones, we put them to have a 100 pixels. The size of the cell was 100 pixels for the row and 100 pixels for the height. But this one, since it is an implicit one, it is not set. So we can set the size of this one using a property. So let's go to the VS Code and see how the grid auto rows property can be used to set the size of this implicit grid. So let's go to the browser. So if you come to this VS Code, you can use the grid auto rows. Grid auto rows. So what this grid auto rows does is that it sets the size of rows of any implicit grid that get created for any item that we add and it's not set in this our container. It will take these values that we define here. So let us define them to also be 100 pixels. So the work of this grid auto rows is to set the size of any implicit container that is added. Any implicit row that is added, not container, any implicit row that is added, the size will be 100 pixels. So now that we added this item 4 and our grid was full, the item 4 will also have a size of 100 pixels like the rest of the items. So you can go to the browser and confirm that. So if you go to the browser, you can see that now item 4 has the size of 100 pixels, and you can see the cells. These cells have the same size as the other cells that were there before, and that is possible because of this grid auto rows. You can see if I turn it off, you can see now the cells are huge. I'm not sure if you can see them. Let me just zoom my screen a little bit. You can see these cells are bigger than those ones. I think that one is clear. So if you put this grid auto rows, it will define the rows of any implicitly created row. And you can see by default, when you add when something extra is added, it comes as a row. By default, our implicit grids adds a row, but you can change. For example, you want if anything to be added, you want it not to be a row, to be a column to come here. So by default, if you add something that is explicit, it will come in the row. But if you want that to change, you want it to come to the column, you can use this property called the grid auto flow property. So let me just write it here. The grid auto flow. In this grid auto flow, by default, the value is row. That is the default value. That's why when you add an item, it comes as a row by default. But you can change this thing by writing here column. So now you can see when you write here column, where is it? Column. You can see now our item has gone in the column. And you can see the size is not equal as the size of these cells because instead of writing grid auto rows, you have to write grid auto columns like that. You have to change this value to be column because you have said any implicit value that is added will not take the value of the predefined cells because it is implicit, it has not been defined. So you have to define it using this grid auto, either rows or columns. So if this is a column, I'll use grid auto columns to define its size like that. So you can see now its size is same as this other size of these other elements. It's 100 pixels width and height. And that is how an extra element, when added, the implicit grid creates it as a row or a column depending on the value of the grid outer flow. And I've said by default the grid outer flow is row. So you can change the value by setting it either to be column or any other thing. And that is how the grid outer flow works. So let us go back to our VS Code and see what is the next thing that we're supposed to learn. Now let me just comment out everything. I'll just comment out these grid items, all of them. Then I'll also comment out this. I'll remove this grid outer rows because I think you've already learned that, and I'll also remove this element 4 here. Just take this out for me to remain only just 3 items. Then now I want to learn something about fractional units. Like when you're defining the rows and the columns, I said before that you can put here either pixel values, or you can use the rems and the ems. You can also use percentages, and you can also use this thing called fractional values. And this fractional value is the one that is most commonly used. So let me just keep my container simple. I'll just have two rows, and I want to have 3 columns. I can put 3 columns like that. But these columns, I don't want them to be 100 pixels. I want them to be a ratio. And I can use the fractional units to define ratios. So if I want all of them to be even, I can just give them 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR. So here I have 3 columns. The first column will have 1 fractional unit. The second one will be 1 FR also, and the third one also will be 1 FR. And that is how you can define your columns using the fractional units. So let's go to the browser and see how this looks like. If you go to the browser, you can see that I have 2 rows and 3 columns. That is how we defined in the grid template rows and grid template columns. So my rows are 100 pixels each. You can see there are 2 of them, and my columns are 3. Each one of them will have this 1 FR. 1 FR is just means this. I told you that this is just like a ratio. So these 3 items will share 1 fractional unit each. So all of them will be equal. But if let's say I wanted the first or the third item to be big, I can give it like 2 FR. So you can see that the third item takes 2 times the width of this compared to this other 2. That is how you can play with the FR. So you can say even something like 3 FR or 4 FR, any. And this is the most common units used for template rows and template columns. This is the common use. But also that doesn't mean that you cannot mix. You can always mix. Like if I say I want the first column to be 100 pixels, I put the 100 pixels. So you can see now the first column is 100 pixels. The second column will be 1 FR. This third column will be 3 FR. So you can mix and match different units to define the rows and columns. It's not a must that you be consistent. You can just mix match them. And that is how you use the grid template columns for the fractional units. So the next thing that I want us to look about is the functions that we can use for defining our values. Because now currently when I try to shrink my, let me return this to 1 FR, this 100 pixels. I think you have seen how that works. So I'll turn it to 1 FR, so it to be a fractional unit. You can see now I have 3 fractional units, but when I try to shrink them, you can see they shrink in that ratio. But I can set, if I let's say this to not shrink more than a certain thing, I can set the maximum value for it to shrink or the minimum value for it to shrink using the min max function. There's a function called the min max function. So if this one was 100 pixels, let me put this back to 100 pixels. Now see if that one was 100 pixels and I try to shrink, it will just remain 100 pixels. It will not shrink more than 100 pixels. It will just remain. You can see it's still the same size, this item 1, because we put it to be 100 pixels. But the rest of them, since they are fractional units, like we said, that fraction is just a ratio. So the fractional units share the remaining space in that given ratio. So if the remaining space is small, they'll have a smaller value because they're sharing the remaining space, and the remaining space is small. And that is why when you shrink it, it will shrink to a smaller size. But then if you want it to shrink, but if you reach a certain position for it not to shrink, you can change that using the min max function. So if I can change this, let's say this third value here, I can use the min max function here, Let me just click on it. I think it's here. Here, instead of writing 2fr, I can put a function here called the min-max function. And inside the min-max function, I can put two values. The first value is the minimum value that can have. And let's say I put the minimum value to be 100 pixels. Then the next value is the maximum value that container can have. Let me put it the way it was, that is 3fr. So you can see now this third element has 3fr, but when I try to shrink it, it will shrink until it reaches 100 pixels. Then it will no longer shrink more than that, and that is how you can achieve that thing by using the min-max function. So you can use the min-max function to set the minimum size of a row or a column, but mostly it's for the columns, because when you shrink, mostly the screen size that changes. When we talked about the responsive design, we said that mostly it's the width that is changing in most cases. But also you can put it in the column if you want to change the height. If you put responsive design here, you can see you can change the height. And if you want to change the height like this, you can set the values of the min max in the column to see what happens when you change the height. But that is how you can use the min max. The min max function is used to set the minimum value that you want that column to be, and this here will be the maximum value that you want that column to be. So you can set any values. So the next element that I want to talk about today is the next function that we can talk about is the repeat function. I told you earlier, here we are writing 100 pixels 2 times, but there's a function called the repeat function. If you want, I can write here repeat. It is a function, and it takes two values. The first value is the number of times you want your element to repeat, and mine is 2 times. And the next value is the size of that element. I'll put 100 pixels. So you can see that my element remains there it was. This function has put 100 pixels twice. So instead of writing 100 pixels 2 times, I can use this repeat function to create the row to have 100 pixels 2 times, and that is how the repeat function works. If you remember, at the beginning of this video, we created like 6 rows and we repeated 100 pixels 6 times. So instead of repeating 100 pixels 6 times, I could have used this repeat function, and here the number of times I wanted to repeat, I could write 6. And you can see if I repeat it 6 times, it will repeat 6 times. You can see the rows go up to 6. You can see the rows goes up to 6, and that is what we achieved in the first place. But now I just leave it to 2. I mean, just leave it to 2. But that is how you use the repeat function. You can see now there are only 2 rows, and the same repeat function you can use them also in the columns. And I think you have understood how you use the repeat function. So that is it with the repeat function. So the next thing that I want us to look about is something called grid gap. So grid gap, let me see if I can write it here. Yeah, I can write it there. So grid gaps add gaps inside grid gap. This one here. So grid gap add space between these elements. So let's say I put grid gap 20 pixels. You can see this one is color green. It's created a 20 pixel space between the elements. You can see it is this green color, and it is equal in both sides. So if you provide one value, that is for both the rows and the column. But if you provide two values, let's say 20 pixels and 10 pixels, I provide two values. I'll provide the first value for the row. You can see this value here is for the row. A row will be 20 pixels, then the column will be 10 pixels. And that is how the grid gap works. It adds space between either rows and the columns. I think that is it with the grid gap. So let's look at the next thing, that is the grid template areas. And this, let's first go to the VS Code to write the grid template areas, because it's too much code. I can't write it here in the developer options. So let's go back to the VS Code and look at how the grid template area works. So before we look at the grid template area, you can see in the notes that this row gap and column gap properties. So I showed you how to use the gap properties, but if you want specific gap in the row, you can use the row gap, or if you want specific gap at the column, you can use the column gap. But you can also use the grid gap, as we saw before. You can use the grid gap, or you can just use it as gap. all of those work the same, have the same effect. So let us look at this thing called grid template areas. So in grid template areas, you can use grid template areas to define you can give names to specific areas. So let me just show you. Let me just put here grid template areas. Grid template area. Or is it this one here? Grid template areas. So I can use this grid template areas to give, I can say it's kind of like to give names, to define names to your specific things. Let me add that fourth shell here because I want to have like 4 sections. So I'll write this item 4, I call this item 4. Let me save this code. So here in my rows, let me put 3 rows. Let me add an extra row here of 100 pixels. But let me put this middle one to be 300 pixels like that. So my first row will be 100 pixels, my second row will be 300 pixels, and my last row will be 100 pixels. And let me just put 2 columns. The first column will be 1 FR, the second column will be 3 FR. So I have 3 rows and 2 columns. So I want to create something like how a web page looks like. So I want to give specific names to my row, my first row and my second row. All the rows and the columns, I want to give them like something like names, because that is work for the grid template areas. Let me just look at grid template areas in my grid template areas in the notes. I don't know where they are, but they're there. You can just search at, look at them here. Naming grids. This one here. So for you to define for you to give names to a grid, you can use this grid template area property, and each row is defined by apostrophe. You can see each row is defined by an apostrophe. So I can come here. Let me first turn off my Prettier, because if I put single quotes in Prettier, will turn them to. Let me first turn off Prettier. If you don't have, if you have your Prettier on, you can also turn it off for this one to work, because I've seen by default Prettier gives me those double quotes, but I want them to be single quotes. So I'll just put here, I'll put 3, because I say I have 3 rows, so I'll put 3 of them like that. So you can say I have 3 of them. Let me just put some space. So now I don't have Prettier, it cannot arrange for me well, so I have to arrange for them and to arrange them myself. So I put 3 apostrophes because I have 3 rows, and inside each row I have 2 columns, so I'll put 2 names. So let me say this one is header. I put here the header, then header once more. So the first column will be header, the second row will be header for the first column will be header, and the second column will be header for the first row. For the second row, and the first column to be main, the second one to be aside like that. Then the last row and all of them to be, and the first column to be footer, and the other column to be footer like that. So let me save this and let me go to the browser, and you can see how this will look like. So let's just go to the browser and see how this will look like. So if I go to the browser, you can see that, oh, I'm not sure why they're not showing the names, but this first one will be header, this one will be main, this one number 4 will be aside, then these 2 here will be footer. Now let me use those names to position my elements using the names. So let us go to the VS Code and position our elements using those names that we created. We have said that grid template areas gives names to our cells. So this one is called header, this one is called header, this one is called main, this one is called aside, this one is called footer, this one is called footer. So I can just position my elements there using the names that I provided. So let us go to the VS Code and see how we can position our elements using the names we gave them. So I'll go in my VS Code. Then in my VS Code, I'll put item 1. Where is item 1? Item 1 is here. Let me just uncomment this code that I commented it. Then item 1, the grid area, I'll give it the name of that cell, and the name was header. Just say here header like that. Then item 2, I can put this one to be item 2 to be main. Then item 3, I need it to be aside. Then item 4, I'll just duplicate this one and rename it to item 4. Then item 4, I'll put it to be footer. So you have seen that the names that we defined here, I am using them to assign values in my, I'm using those names to assign values here. And that is how, let me format my document first. That is how the grid template area works. You can give these cells names and use the names to position your elements. So let's go to the browser and see how this element should be positioned the way you have written them there. Go to the browser, you can see that our first element, this one, covers the first top part, all of it, because it's set it to cover this header. You remember this cell, this first cell, you call it header, this second cell, you call it header. So we say that item 1 should cover header, and header is all of this. Let me hover this if it can show it. It cannot show. Okay, then item 2, we put item 2 to cover main, and this was the cell that we named it main, and this is the cell that item 2 covered. Item 3, we said item 3 to cover aside, and this is the aside that item 3 covered. Then item 4 covered the footer, and this is all of this is the footer. So that is how you can name your cells and assign positions to items using those names you provided. I think that one is clear. So let us look at the next content, that is justify content and justify items and align items. So to learn about the justify items and align items, I'll just comment everything. Let me just comment all these things here and allow me to remove this top code, all of it. I'll just remove everything from here. I'll just remove these grid template areas. You've already seen how that works, so I'll just delete it. Then I'll just redefine my rows again. Let me put my rows to be even simpler. I'll just use the repeat. We already talked about repeat. And my row to be 100 pixels, and to have 4 rows each of 100 pixels, and also to have 4 columns each of 1 FR. So I'll just paste this one here. Then instead of 100 pixels, I'll write 1 FR. So you can see now I'll be having 4 rows and 4 columns. So now let's talk about the justify items and the align items. So by default, justify items, as we said, this was the same thing that we looked at in the flexbox. It aligns item in the main axis. So by default, the default value of this one in grid is the stretch. All of these align items and justify items and align items. Let me write here align items below here. Align items, the default value is the stretch. So by default, they have a value of stretch. Let me put here stretch. This is the default value in. So let's go to the browser and see how we can play these different values and how they behave. So if you go to the browser, you can see that this is the default behavior of our items. So you can always change the value of this align justify items and align items. Let us change the value this one to be start, and you can see it aligns at the start. And if I put align items also start, you can see the effect of that. So this justify items, as we said before, it aligns items along the main axis, and so the main axis runs from left to right. So if I put here something like end, we go at the end. You have seen it start at the end. And align items is from top to bottom. So if I put start, it will be at the top. If I put end, it will be at the bottom. So that is how you play with the justify items and the align items, like the items property. There's also other values like the center. There's other values like center, which will place the items at the center. So if I put here center, you can see that justify items will be center. Then if I put this also center, the element will be perfectly centered in that cell. You can see that element is perfectly centered in that cell. So I think that is it with the justify items and align items. So let us look at what if you want to move only one element at a time, and that is where the justify self and align self comes in. Just similar to flexbox, where This one, if you put the elements in the parent container, it affects all of them. But if you sell each element individually, it will affect only an individual element. So let us go to the browser and try and write a code. Or can I write it here? Let me see if I can write it here. Item 1 is not styled, so I can't write it here. So let's go to the VS Code and write the code for this item 1. So if I want to move a specific item, I'll use the same align and justify, but it will be justify self and align self. Let us test it with this item 1. Let me remove this comment and put it a little bit down here. So here in item 1, I can say justify self and put the value to be, let's say, start. Then align self, put the value also to be start. Let us go to the browser and see how this will look like. So if you go to the browser, you can see only item 1 is the one that has moved. So it said the default value is stretch. So if I put here stretch, you can see it will stretch on the main axis, and if I put this value stretch, it will also stretch in there. So this is the default values. So you can just, if I want to change this for only one value, I can put here, let's say, center, and it will be at only that one item will be at the center. Then I can also put align items center. So this align justify self and align self takes the same values as the justify items and align items for the container. But these ones, you just move a specific item. Like you have seen here, just moving this only one item, and that is how you can move a specific item inside the cell. So let's look at another thing, that is justify content and align content. Don't confuse justify items and align items to justify content and align content. If you say items, I only mean these items, and content, I mean everything, all this container. So let's go to the browser and see how this justify content differs from the justify items. Or I can just style it here. So instead of justify items, let me put justify content here. If I say justify content, I say maybe center. Let me expand the screen. Then justify then I say align content. Then let me say center. So you can see how that has effect. It puts the element, it moves all the, it moves the whole container. So this does not move only one element. This justify content and align content moves the whole of the container. So if I say justify content, I say something like flex or space evenly. Space between. There'll be space between but it's just one item, so you cannot see that space unless I say space around. And so there'll be space around unless I adjust the size of this cell. But you can just see the effect with when I use the align content. When I change the value of the align content, you can see it has some effect. If I say align content space evenly or space around, you can see the space around those content. If I say space evenly, there'll be space evenly. I think you're seeing how the container is moving. I think my screen is not visible, so you can see how that container is moving. I think that everything there is visible. So you can see how. So the difference between justify content and align, align content and justify self and align self is that when you use the justify item, not self, justify item. If you use justify item, you are moving these specific items. That is when you use justify item. And also when you use align items, you are aligning these items inside the cell. But if you use justify content, you are aligning this all of these elements, all of this container that we defined. How will it be aligned inside this parent container? And you have seen how that has effect. So if you say justify content, you mean all of it. When you say justify items, you mean these items inside the cell. How will they behave inside that cell? And that is the difference between the content. The difference is just the last word, content, and that one was items. So you can say justify content or say justify items, and you can say align items or align content. And you say the difference between justify and align is that justify defines how elements will be placed in the main axis, and align defines how elements will be placed in the cross axis. And say by default the main axis is from left to right, and the cross axis is from top to bottom. We talked that in depth when learning about Flexbox. So that is it with the justify content and align content. So the next thing that we learn is how simple is it to make a responsive design using Gridbox. That is the next thing. To make a responsive design using Gridbox. In short, here we'll not use media queries. There's a keyword we'll learn, and that will save our time to make a responsive design. So let us go to learn that keyword. So we're supposed to learn how to create a responsive grid without using the media queries that we learned. So and to create a responsive grid without using any media queries. So let me just delete this justify items, and let me just remove this content for justify items there, and also let me just comment this item 1. Let me just remove this comment and place it up here. Let me just write the comment manually like that. So yeah, this one is commented. Then if you remember, we talked about the min max per pattern. I said min max when you shrink a value and you've set the min max, the minimum value will not shrink more than that. We already talked about the min max value, and that is the one that I want to use. It's a function, min max function, and it takes two values. The minimum size of the cell, mine is 100, and to put it 100 pixels, and the maximum I want it to be 1 FR. So I think we already talked about this. So if you let us go to the browser and see how this is. If you stretch, it will not stretch more than. If you shrink, it will not shrink more than 100 pixels, but when you stretch, it will take 1 FR. So let's just go to the browser and see how this is. If you go to the browser, you can see that I have 4 rows and 4 columns, and I put the columns to have a min max of 100 pixels and 1 FR, so that when I try to shrink, it will shrink, but when it reaches 100 pixels, it will no longer shrink. You can see when it reaches 100 pixels, it's no longer shrinks. But the problem is, when it reaches 100 pixels, it breaks. You can see that the container is outside there. You can see this line, this container is outside this red line, and that is an issue. And when we're talking about responsive design, this is not something that you want to have in our code. So to solve that issue, in Gridbox is just simple. Where is that container? You just replace this one with a keyword called auto fit, like this. Auto fit. So when I put there an auto fit keyword, where every time I try to stretch, if the element does not fit, it will wrap to the next element. And you see that way I have created a responsive. You can see a responsive design. So you can see I've created a responsive design without using any media queries. So if someone is viewing this container, maybe they have a huge screen, they'll be viewing 4 elements, 4 items in one row. But when someone is using a medium-sized screen, when the screen is a little bit low, they'll view 3 elements in one row. If someone is using even a smaller screen, they'll view 2 elements in one row. And someone maybe is using a smaller screen than that, they'll be viewing 1 element in one row. So you can see that is the responsive design that you're talking about when you talked about the responsive design. This is the thing that you wanted to achieve. But we were achieving this using media queries. So you can see here we can achieve this thing without using any media queries. And you can see that is easier. Just put the auto fit keyword and you're done. So that is very simple to achieve a responsive design using the grid container. So that is it for today's class, guys. See you in the next class. Peace out.